Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Freiburg Conversations on Tafsir and Transregional Islamic Networks. I'm really delighted to have Ahmed El Shamsy as a speaker today and Islam Dayeh as his discussant. And I think that Ahmed probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but very briefly, he's professor of Islamic studies at the University of Chicago, and he started working on the canonization of Islamic law. That's his first book, where he basically looks at the transformation of Islamic law from a primarily oral tradition to a written discipline in this period of time. And in his second book, which has just been published, he looks at a, I think, quite similar instance of media change, or similar in some ways maybe, but in a different period of time in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So in rediscovering the Islamic classics, how editors and print culture transformed an intellectual tradition, he shows how Arabic editors and publishers really changed the landscape of Islamic religious scholarship by their choices to rediscover classics and to publish them, so to transform them from print, from manuscript to print format. This is a very exciting book, and I'm really glad to have Ahmed here to talk to us about this topic broadly and more specifically its impact on tafsir. So welcome, Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for the invitation. Thank you also to Majid Danishka and to Islam Dayeh for agreeing to have a conversation with me on this topic. I have to say I have very much enjoyed participating in this workshop so far, either live on Zoom or watching it later on YouTube. And it has really given me new ideas and questions that I want to also partly address today. In addition, to my surprise, several of the presenters in attendance seem to have read my book, and so I didn't want to go over the material they have already read, and that is why I've changed my original topic to make it a little bit more specific and to include new material that is related to earlier talks in this series that I've seen here in the last couple of weeks. But overall, this still takes place within the overall thematic universe of my book. Now, the new title of this talk contains the phrase return of the repressed, which comes from psychoanalysis. And it means, well, it refers to a memory that is repressed from the conscious to the unconscious level, but that reasserts itself at some point. So I'm drawing here a parallel between the rediscovery of Islamic classics and that psychoanalytic idea. The reason why I think this analogy is valid is that writing can function as something like an unconscious in a society. In a purely oral society, people either maintain memories or they forget them. And once they have forgotten something, it is irretrievably lost. Once you have books, however, a culture can forget for generations and centuries before recovering the ideas again. And I think the process of and reason for repression and remembering can grant us important insights into the history of ideas in various historical periods. And what I want to do today is investigate this process more closely with regards to a case study of Al-Tabari's tafsir. As I already mentioned in my book, even in the 1890s, well-connected manuscript experts like Ahmed Zaki Basha only knew of Tabari's tafsir secondhand, and in his case through a Suyuti's Itqan fi ulum al-Qur'an. What I will do here, very briefly, I'll try to stay under the 10 minutes set out in the original call, is to explore how unknown Al-Tabari really was in the 19th century and the reason why such a famous work had fallen into oblivion. To answer this question, let us turn to Abu Thana Mahmoud al-Alusi's multi-volume tafsir Ruh al-Ma'ani, written between 1836 and 1851. This work has rightly been described as the great late Ottoman tafsir. In this work, I have found around 900 instances in which Al-Alusi cites or quotes Al-Tabari. Now, compare this to over 1,200 quotations from Abu Hayyan's 14th century Al-Bahr al-Muhit. In addition, Alusi's quotations do not look like they are taken directly from a copy of Al-Tabari's. They're simply signposted as Qala Al-Tabari or Qala Ibn Jarir or such, as opposed to the citations from, for example, Abu Hayyan's work, which sometimes take the form of Qala Abu Hayyan fi kitabihi or Qala Abu Hayyan fi bahrihi, etc. Given the ubiquity of quotes from Abu Hayyan and also from As-Suyuti's Ad-Durr al-Manthur in Alusi's work, I checked the Tabari quotes in Alusi's tafsir against the discussions of the same verses in Abu Hayyan and As-Suyuti, and I found that Alusi is in fact citing Tabari only through Abu Hayyan and As-Suyuti and not directly. Now, while As-Suyuti most probably did read the Tabari's tafsir himself, Abu Hayyan does not quote At-Tabari directly either, but rather only through Ibn Atiyah, who is his fellow Granadan scholar who lived 2 centuries before Abu Hayyan. In other words, in the 19th century, Al-Alusi had only known At-Tabari's opinions third-hand via Abu Hayyan and Ibn Atiyah, and second-hand through As-Suyuti. That is the first point I wanted to make. Even the grandest late Ottoman author of a Quranic exegesis seems to have read At-Tabari indirectly, second or even third hand. The second point is to suggest why At-Tabari had been forgotten in this way. In my book, I lay out various kinds of reasons for the disappearance of classical texts, particularly in the 3 or so centuries preceding the introduction of print into the Muslim world in the 19th century. But in the remaining time of my presentation, I want to focus on one particular instance to demonstrate the logic of forgetting that is at work here. In an earlier session of this workshop, Samuel Ross asked Walid Saleh about the first edition of Abu Hayyan's Al-Bahr al-Muhit, published by the Matba'at al-Sa'ada in the 1930s, and about rumors that the text had been tampered with. The origin of this claim is the Ottoman emigre to Cairo, Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, and he was right. One sentence of this large tafsir had been omitted from the edition, a sentence that the publisher found either objectionable or slanderous or whatever. I don't know exactly his motivation. But in this famous sentence, Abu Hayyan claims that he had read a work by Ibn Taymiyyah on the divine throne. And in this work, Ibn Taymiyyah had claimed that the Prophet Muhammad will sit with God on the throne, presumably on the Day of Judgment. And Abu Hayyan clearly implies that this is a scandalous opinion, and that he that somehow this depicts Ibn Taymiyyah in a extremely deviant light. Now, this claim there are some textual problems about this, given that we have this work on the throne by Ibn Taymiyyah, but no section in this would correspond to Abu Hayyan's claim. However, in Ibn Taymiyyah's Majmu' al-Fatawa, we have a section that could fit the bill. So I assume the most likely explanation is that Abu Hayyan got the reference wrong and referred to this fatwa. In it, Ibn Taymiyyah simply cites a report that the Tabi'i scholar Mujahid had said that Muhammad would sit with God on the throne. Furthermore, Ibn Taymiyyah, that's where we get back to Tabari, explicitly cites At-Tabari for this report, and that At-Tabari defended the possibility of this report being true. If we look at the discussion in At-Tabari, it occurs in the exegesis of the praised station, al-Maqam al-Mahmud, that is promised to Muhammad. Asa an yab'athuka rabbuka maqaman mahmudan, etc. 1779. The interpretation that At-Tabari supports primarily is that the station refers to the privilege of intercession on behalf of his community on the Day of Judgment for Muhammad. But he also mentions the report from Mujahid about God seating Muhammad with him on the throne. Al-Tabari then states in a really interesting theological discussion that this report is neither unreliably transmitted nor rationally impossible or violating basic Islamic theological principles. He still prefers the other interpretation, but he makes a point of saying that this report wouldn't be, there's nothing wrong about this report, accepting this report, contrary to what some contemporary theologians had argued. Now, if we look at the tafsir tradition, Thalabi in the 11th, 5th century still explicitly supported Tabari's stance on this report. However, his student Al-Wahidi had shifted, and he called this report despicable, strange, and repulsive. Radlun muhishun fadhi'un. And another generation later, Ibn Atiyah, who I mentioned already, called Tabari's discussion of this report deviant talk. Abu Hayyan, who, as mentioned already, only knew Al-Tabari through Ibn Atiyah, omits any mention that Tabari had defended the theoretical coherence of this report, and only admits that Tabari includes this report, and Suyuti cites the report directly from Mujahid without mentioning Al-Tabari. So by the time we get to the actual sources of Al-Alusi, there is no evidence anymore in these tafsir that Al-Tabari had defended this report as actually a possible, possibly, I mean, both theologically possible and as a reliable report. Why is it then that in Ibn Abu Hayyan's discussion, Ibn Taymiyyah is a religious deviant, while Al-Tabari is not? So if we remember, he assigns this opinion to Ibn Taymiyyah, while he should also know from his sources that Al-Tabari held the same opinions. Well, I would argue that Tabari, as presented by Abu Hayyan, was a kind of domesticated Tabari. The Tabari, as preserved in the second-hand quotations of Abu Hayyan, only mentioned a strange report about Muhammad sitting with God, rather than as someone that considered this report rationally coherent and defensible. In his selective form of remembering, Tabari could maintain his position on the pedestal of Sunni classics without coming into conflict with the Ash'ari orthodoxy of the Mamluk period, which could not stomach such a report. Ibn Taymiyyah, on the other hand, was a contemporary of Abu Hayyan. They in fact knew each other, and he could therefore not be defanged in the way that Al-Tabari was, and therefore had to be depicted as an outlier and deviant for putting forward the very same position that Al-Tabari had expressed 4 centuries earlier. The process of pruning Tabari's positions through the selective preservation of his opinions went hand in hand with the sidelining and subsequently disappearance of his actual work from circulation. Taken together, these processes did not just constitute a process of accidental forgetting, but of forgetting for a purpose. In other words, a process of repression, not in the sense of censorship or other forms of coordinated action, but rather in a more subconscious process of pushing a memory out of consciousness because it produces conflicts that one wants to avoid. When Abu Thana al-Alusi wrote his grand tafsir half a millennium after Abu Hayyan, the fact that he had only access to Al-Tabari's work through the distorting lenses of Abu Hayyan and the Suyuti's works is a testament to the success of this repression. Yet when this repression was by its nature incomplete and precarious. By perpetuating his name and reputation, later tafsir contained enough information to whet the appetites of 19th century Muslim scholars who sought to expand the literary horizon of available works, particularly by finding older works. So half a century after Al-Alusi had completed his tafsir, Al-Tabari's tafsir was resurrected by means of the powerful tool of the printing press. The work had survived in a handful of copies in marginal areas. So the most important manuscript for the Tabari edition came from the Al-Rashid ruler of Ha'il in the Arabian Peninsula, and then was printed in Cairo with the support of, among others, Muhammad Abdu. When then 30 years later, Abu Hayyan's tafsir was finally published, and Al-Kawthari pointed out that the section about Ibn Taymiyyah and the issue of Muhammad on the divine throne was missing, Al-Kawthari was not just doing this for the sake of philological accuracy, but rather as part and parcel of his lifelong project to, so to speak, put the genie back into the bottle that had escaped when classical texts had been rediscovered and printed and were now directly accessible rather than through the distorting lens of post-classical orthodoxies. As a final note on Jamaluddin al-Qasimi, about whose tafsir Peter Coppens talked a few weeks ago, al-Qasimi had read the newly published tafsir of Al-Tabari by the time he wrote his own work. Yet he rejected the report by Mujahid, not because of lingering Ash'ari sensitivities, but rather because he didn't think it explained the verse in question very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was really fascinating. Can you tell us a bit? I mean, you've given a very interesting example of how this kind of repression and rediscovery worked. But what were the guiding principles in choosing what was rediscovered and what was? I mean, what people continued to repress or chose not to remember. You mentioned a theological example, but I assume also from Walid Saleh's work, there were also hermeneutical considerations, like the rise of this paradigm where hadith-based tafsir was preferable to, I don't know, Israeliyat and whatever. So can you say a bit more about this?
So, I mean, again, it's difficult to make too general statements, but to give I think a very interesting example, when Muhammad Abdu was in exile in Beirut, he went to Tripoli and visited Rashid Rida. We met Rashid Rida for the first time. Rida was still a student, and Abdu asked Rida, so what kind of tafsir do they teach here? And Rida says, they read not Ruh al-Ma'ani, but Ruh al-Bayan by Ismail Haq Bursavi. That's the only tafsir that is taught here. In fact, I mean, who knows this tafsir today, but it was actually the first tafsir that was printed in Bulaq. If you start looking at it, there are interesting issues in it. I mean, I think actually Ismail Haq read Tabari. He knew. I think he had read Tabari. It's of course an earlier work, but it has lots of stuff in it that is quite. This is not a tafsir that, I mean, the idea. There's lots of material in it, but is it really tafsir? Right? There's this whole discussion at the beginning about why does God start the Qur'an with a ba rather than with an alif? It's because the alif stands tall, is arrogant. The ba that lies down, so this kind of, what is this? And Rashid Rida says, this is just like, what? It's just nonsense. They're teaching us here about the Quran. And at that point, Abdu says, the kashaf. That's the tafsir you should study, right? So it's not that these people were needed to these modernists were necessarily focused on kind of tafsir based on akhbar. They were also open to other types of tafsir, but there was clearly an unhappiness about the kind of the things that were available. And I think what I try to depict in my book is that at least beginning in the second half of the 19th century, it was like an exciting age of discovery, of just taking stock, like what books actually still survive. I mean, first of all, what great books were there So they look at Kashf al-Dhunun, or they just look at any kind of reference works that could tell them, that could give them an idea what were interesting works that had existed before, and then do they still exist? Are there manuscripts of this work? And it's a very difficult work, given that the amount of manuscripts that were still in private hands, so that there needed to be these networks of information, both within the Muslim world, but also with Orientalist scholars. But at the same time, also it's the time of founding of kind of new research universities that have catalogs for their manuscripts, etc. So it's this kind of information gathering exercise, and then this kind of republic of letters where these people write back and forth and say, do you know any interesting works on this topic, or any interesting works that are that can serve whatever kind of reformist or intellectual agendas that these people had at this time, or interests. So it's a complex matter, but it's a time of ferment in which, I mean, if there is a guiding principle, is that is the discovery that there are ideas that there are ideas that are not in the open. The idea of repression, that there are ideas that have somehow been neglected, that have fallen out of the tradition, and that the tradition really is not perfect, or it really is not preserving everything that is worth preserving, and that there are treasures to be uncovered that are going to contribute to kind of nahda, right, to a kind of a renaissance, to a kind of rise in social, cultural, religious, intellectual kind of dimensions.
Okay, but what was the special appeal of Tabari? I mean, if you look at the introduction of the Tafsir al-Manar, this is Rashid Rida's version, so we don't know if it happened that way, but Rashid Rida says he asked Muhammad Abdu to do Tafsir, and Muhammad Abdu initially refused and said everything has been said and done. And then Rashid Rida also says he asked him, like, what classical Tafsir should I read? And Muhammad Abdu says, for the philological stuff and so on, read Zamakhshari. And Rashid Rida acts a bit surprised and says, why Zamakhshari? And isn't he kind of, I don't know, reprehensible or something because he wasn't favored by the Ottoman madrasas? And Muhammad Abdu says, no, he's fine. But then Muhammad Abdu does his own tafsir, and his main claim his main argument why he's doing is that the Quran should act as hidayah. So it should be guidance to believers. And this is like the opposite of what they are doing in the madrasas, where they have scholastic discussions, they have Israeliyat, they have all kinds of philological detail that, according to Muhammad Abdu, is not, is just distracting from the actual meaning of the Quran. So what help is Tabari with if you have this idea of the function of the Quran? So
I think there is a dimension of a Tabari that has a, so that, somebody like Abu Hayyan, for example, in the introduction of his Quran, says, the early Mufassirun, they were interested basically with history, like the historical context of the Quran. But we later ones, we are more interested in the kind of, in the language, because we've become more distanced from the language of the Quran. So we have to explain much more about the language. But I think there's something about, Zamakhshari or Baydawi or something like this, where these are interesting rhetorical, grammatical analysis of the Quran, but, the kind of, whether it's Asbab al-Nuzul or the akhbar around kind of the early community, etc., that is just missing from these tafsir. It's just a different type of turning a text, like, what is the immediate reception or earlier reception of this text? What are the reasons for these individual verses, rather than abstracting them, analyzing them with these kind of rhetorical, grammatical analyses, etc. So it's a different way of looking at the text, and in many respects, if you want to write, about the early Muslim community, which tafsir are you going to look at? You're not going to really look at Zamakhshari, right? I mean, as a help for your of your analysis, you would rather much rather look like at the Tabari. And so I think there's also a turn in the modern period towards kind of just a kind of looking at there's something about the madrasa tradition that is quite flat. And we have these discussions about scholars saying these madrasa scholars they study these texts and they don't know that these authors they're discussing, they live like 500 years apart, and one in Central Asia and one in Morocco. For them, this is just these texts talking to each other. But there's a kind of a reintroduction of history and context that for which like certain writers and certain works are really helpful for them to think through it like that.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, Al-Maturidi's tafsir, for example, which was roughly contemporaneous to Tabari, I think, was only printed like a few years ago. So clearly there were some things that people were interested in then, and some that they were not interested in. Or was this an element of chance, like what manuscripts they had access to, or what? Do you think this was a...
that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, there are various issues to this. Partly it is like if you read a Suyuti's Itqan, for example, I mean, so there's some text, like part of this movement of rediscovery is you discover one text by chance, whatever, or this text already, and that text mentions various classical texts, and then you go out and search for those texts. And I don't remember Suyuti discussing Maturidi's tafsir in the Itqan, for example. So there's part of that. There's a kind of, you take certain things as guides to other things. If you read an author who says, yeah, that is nonsense tafsir or whatever, then people don't, they might not be motivated to go out and look for those texts. Then there are sometimes, of course, issues of chance, issues of, the Ottoman libraries at a certain point, the Ottoman libraries after the establishment of Turkey become much less accessible to Arab scholars, for example, and so there's very few avenues through which to access this stuff. So Muhammad Zahir al-Kawthari sits in Cairo. He knows a lot about these libraries, but he doesn't have access to them. His networks have been severed. So basically the one person that you ask at this point is Helmut Ritter, right? Who's this German Orientalist who kind of exiled into Istanbul, and he's the person you write to, and he photographs it, and he sends you the microfilms for a small fee. So these networks then connect also with Orientalist networks, and then what is accessible at a certain point, what is not accessible. Of course, in the Soviet republics, until today, most of these texts aren't available. But so that there's political issues, there's issues of, I have letters, between Egypt and Iraq after World War I, where these scholars would like to send each other things, but there is no postal service. So Ahmed Zaki in Egypt says, well, how about I send it to Gertrude Bell, right? She can receive through military mail. She can receive packages. So how about? So he talks to Mahmoud Shukri al-Alusi. How about you go to Gertrude Bell then and receive your mail from her? So there's practical issues involved as well. But intellectually speaking, I mean, these are discussions that are going on, and in my book I've only scratched the surface of it.
Yeah. Speaking of Orientalists, I mean, this is one very interesting aspect. If you look at the Encyclopedia of the Islam first edition, the entry on tafsir, they basically discussed Baydawi, which was the tafsir that was printed in Europe, like in the early Orientalist tradition, and it was also printed for use in the Ottoman madrasas, I think, in the 19th century. And then Goldziher wrote his book on Muslim Quranic exegesis, I think, in the 1920s. And suddenly Tabari is like the norm, I mean, you have Tabari as a kind of mainstream normal tafsir, and then you have the others as like Mu'tazili and Sunni, Sufi and whatever, like the sects or tendencies or whatever. So in a way, the activities of these editors and publishers were really successful because they kind of shaped not only Arab views of what the tradition actually looks like or should look like, but also Orientalist scholarship. And then you had this backlash, like the rediscovery of the 17th, 18th century, and the strong, sympathy for the later, like what you call post-classical tradition. And also some of Walid Saleh's writings are in this vein, I think, with respect to tafsir. And now your book seems to be kind of pushing back against this and saying like, okay, but maybe these, editors and publishers, etc., with their criticism of post-classical scholarship, they had a legitimate grievance here. It wasn't just, Salafism, Puritanism, I don't know, the wish to destroy ambiguity or whatever. It was actually a legitimate grievance. So
I mean, that's part of the issue, right? Everybody is just basically writing against the last generation. I mean, it's not just against, but just finding. I mean, I think overall we are still progressing, right? It's not just back and forth, but we're just making the picture more and more detailed. I mean, I think it's important to keep both ideas in your head, right? It's not that, oh, was the classical period good or was the post-classical period good, but that there are good reasons for these two things to develop in their own, that they have their own internal logics. But what is just important for me to think is that first of all, that exactly what you said, we are to a large extent children of these editorial decisions that were made in the 19th and early 20th century about what to publish and what not to publish. So that the idea of, the great books in a tradition is not a static thing, but it's something that keeps being renegotiated at specific points, specific important points. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that there are I think the re-evaluation of whatever 17th, 18th century tafsir or works in general shouldn't then leave these modernists in the kind of camp of, oh, they were just they were just brainwashed by the Orientalists or something like this. But like, no, they had their own reasons for it, and they were not just simplistic reasons. And I think that's why I mentioned this thing about Al-Qasimi at the end. Al-Qasimi didn't say, oh, Al-Tabari says this, now we've, whatever, I've thrown overboard whatever the whole tradition. No, he actually looked at it and says, well, if you look at it, it says Maqam Mahmud, Maqam Qama, it's not about the Prophet sitting, it's like it's the opposite of sitting, right? Sitting on the throne, it's a station, it's a place where you stand. So it says it's not, this would be that would make no sense as an explanation. So that there's no to have these simple genealogies of, okay, so these people who who printed this stuff in the early 20th century and what was his name, Osama bin Laden, like it's just like one line of intellectual genealogy. The simple genealogies is also, I think, is kind of destructive for a scholarly field to engage and to kind of produce these very simplistic narratives.
Yeah, I mean, there might also be, there are also developments over time that change how we might perceive these, I don't know, intentions or strategies. Like when Muhammad Abduh, for example, says he wants to do tafsir without, I don't know, scholastic details or Israeliyat or, I don't know, big philosophy and kalam discussions and so on. For him, maybe in his context, it was a liberating vision of how to do tafsir. But if you find it reproduced like now, like 100, 120 years later, it is kind of ceased to be liberating. It is simply a way to obliterate a big part of actually the tafsir tradition and to reduce it to something very small and, I don't know, one-sided. which might not have been the original intention. I don't know. So maybe it's probably impossible to free ourselves completely from these contemporary things that are happening. But yeah, I mean, your book certainly makes a case for looking at these people against the backdrop of their own time and their own concerns, and which was not with contemporary Salafism, but with, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire and whatnot. So yeah. Thank you very much. That was really, really impressive and interesting. And to anyone who hasn't read Ahmed's book, I can really recommend it. I think it's a hugely important work, not least because it really leads us to reflect our own work as Islamicists and the works like the Islamic works we are using and reading and studying, and those we are not, and the reasons for which this is the case. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the discussant, Islam Dayeh, who will comment on what he has heard and give his own perspective on this. And Islam Dayeh is probably the best person we could find to do this, because much of his work is also in this field of Arabic editing and publishing. He's assistant professor at the Freie Universität Berlin and director of a junior research group, Arabic Philology and Textual Practices in the Early Modern Period. So welcome, Islam.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Ahmed, for this very interesting and rich presentation. And also thank you, Johanna and Majid, for inviting me. And also would like to congratulate Ahmed on his recent book. It's a wonderful study, and I enjoyed it very much. And I was surprised that we were working on very similar topics at the same time, and somehow reached at the same results. I have a few questions or observations I'd like to make. I'll start with the issue of the return of repressed, and ask Ahmed whether he thinks, my feeling is that the discourse of ihya, of revival, nahda, the classicizing tendency that we find among the editors, whether they are the Nahdawi, nationalist secular branch, or the Salafi, or the, on that whole spectrum, that these tendencies generate a discourse or a feeling of something having been repressed. And so when Ahmed Zaki Basha, for example, talks about in his inability to find copies of Al-Tabari's tafsir, I haven't seen that passage. I saw it in your book. I just wonder whether that and other editors also assertions that they have not been able to find similar texts. I'm thinking of editors of Mu'tazili texts, for example, those, the school of Muhammad Abdu, the Egyptians who were interested in reviving Mu'tazili, new Mu'tazili schools, and they also talk about their discoveries as also a liberation of a repressed text. Now, whether that is the case, I mean, whether they've actually done the survey and checked all the libraries and catalogs is a different story. So maybe we should be a bit careful when we read these statements at the time, especially 1880s for Ahmed Zaki Basha, knowing that at the time he was interested in, and then throughout his career, mostly in historical and geographical texts and adab, right? So his interest in Al-Tabari's tafsir is precisely as you said, Ahmed, about he's interested in the sources of the Arab nation, Al-Ummah al-Arabiya. Its folklore, its traditions, its akhbar. And of course, the Zamakhshari and Baydawi and that tradition is poor in that regard. So we have here Ahmed Zaki, whose interest in Al-Tabari is primarily a historian's interest. I think around the same time he edits As-Sakhawi's Tibr al-Masbuk, and then even later on he continues with editing primarily historical texts. And so it seems to me that Ahmed Zaki Basha was actually well aware of the fact that Al-Tabari is not a tafsir in the way we have come to think of Al-Tabari. So, and this connects to what to the anecdote that you mentioned of Ibn Hayyan in his introduction, you know, making this distinction between the earlier mufassirin, who are more like historians and akhbaris or naqala of ruwa, and what tafsir had become after the madrasa tradition, especially with Zamakhshari and all the books and commentaries it generated. So if we start to think of Al-Tabari's tafsir as more like a hadith or an akhbar source, you know, rather than a tafsir in the sense of, you know, the way we think of Zamakhshari or Baydawi or other works, then it's perhaps not so surprising that the work was not so widely available and accessible. That's just because it was never taught in the madrasa. It can never be taught in a madrasa. So, and those who can read it are advanced scholars who will have the skill and the ability to read these works independently. And thinking in the Ottoman context, that would have been called mutala'a. And so very few copies would have been made of such a work. So Ahmed Zaki's surprise, maybe it was not surprising for other scholars. If you would ask Alusi, he would have said, yeah, it's not everyone reads Al-Tabari, but a few copies do exist, but we don't reproduce them, as many as the other works that are taught in the madrasa and such. So it's just I'm just raising these questions to make us maybe a bit more attentive to what the discourse is all about. When they say we are reviving a text or we are bringing it out from, you know, repression. That's the first point. The second has to do with, and then Al-Tabari has a new life, of course, when in the 20th century, because it then, I think Ahmed Zaki's primary intention was to revive or re-edit, bring to life the historical sources, al-usul, he calls them, al-usul al-adab al-Arabiya. Then once it's edited using these al-Rashid copies and it's put read in a new context, it becomes a Salafi text used and read in a particular context against the long tradition of Zamakhshari and the Ash'ari tradition. So yeah, I think we have to distinguish here between different editorial approaches and different ideologies attached to these editorial projects. And this leads me to the last point, which is a general point, and it's something that you discuss extensively, Ahmed, in your book, which is the idea of the classics. And you know, it's also connected to the first point I raised. It's about so books that were. So if you read manuals of, you know, Adab al-Talab, or if you look at the biographies of the ulama in the later centuries, you'll see the standard books. You know, they studied the Alfiyya, they studied this book and that, and it's formalized. There's a pattern. But they also see that they read mutawwalat, as they were called, the longer the books. So Tabari's book would then have been called a mutawwala after in the madrasa period. But then that doesn't really tell us about the extent to which the manuscripts were available, right? So how are we going to use these sources, these biographical sources? What do they tell us about the availability and accessibility of these texts? If a scholar says, I read this and that person's tafsir. I've come across instances where in Al-Biqai's Tarajim, where he mentions that he read a book in a library, right? He borrowed the book. He saw the book in someone else's library and borrowed it, or borrowed parts of it, ajza. So he, at long tafsir or long work, he just borrowed part of a book. And particularly books that were not taught in the madrasa. So we're talking again about these mutala'at books, these long adab works, tarikh works, tafsir, particularly Tabari, and maybe other prohibited works. So books that were on a certain list, certain Sufi texts and Mu'tazili texts that were in circulation, but they were not reproduced for different reasons. But people knew about them, and they would read them through these networks. And I think this phenomenon continued to the 19th century. The scholars knew about these texts. They knew where to find them. They were not available widely. And it's so if this is true, if my observation is true, then it would appear that Ahmed Zaki's surprise at not finding any texts, any copies, is what is surprising. Right? That Ahmed Zaki was not a part of that network. Let's remember that Ahmed Zaki was not an Azhari, and he was a kind of outsider in that world of the religious institutions. And most of his work was done with Orientalists, as you point out, Ahmed, yourself in your chapter. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of this conversation.
Thank you.
Can I make a short response to this?
Yes, of course.
So the reason why I spoke about Al-Alusi in this framework is that exactly, that is part of this kind of process of discovery for myself, is just to think like, okay, I went into this book project thinking that somebody like Al-Alusi would have read Tabari. Like, okay, even if we don't have manuscripts today in Baghdad, surely somebody like Al-Alusi would have had to maybe these manuscripts were destroyed in some whatever instance, whatever, he must have had. But even somebody who is really a specialist and who spends 15 years of his life researching this and doing this did not have access to these works. And so I think there is a difference. I totally agree with Islam, let's say on the Mamluk period, that people who were serious about this, like a Suyuti, for example, even in the early 16th century, still could see a Tabari's work. But by the 19th century, I think what somebody like, this is not just Zaki's issue. Muhammad Abdu was very much an Azhari also insider, but he has this whole list of complaints where he says, like, look at all those great early people. None of these books we have anymore. And we have that in the realm of history, for example, as well, right? The Tabari's history is also lost, and there is no, Egyptians in the early 19th century, they say, historians who say, like, we have all this great history of historians writing in Arabic, but none of these books have survived, so they're complaining, and again, insider Azharis who are saying, we can't find, there's only small fragments that we can still find in these libraries that we have access to. So I think analyzing works of people who wrote this period, the assumption that they must have known. I have this strange feeling. I have, when I sit in my office and wrote this recent book, is this feeling of, wait, I have access to all those works that people 150 years ago, like even the greatest scholars, didn't have. It's not. I have them in my office. I can download them from PDF in a minute if I want to. But these people had to spend years and years, and they only saw a fragment of it or something like this. So, I think this is something that we need to make conduct much more studies exactly on what what access people did have. And of course, there are these private networks of manuscripts. We can't just look at public manuscript libraries. But all the evidence I have found is that, that a scholar in the 19th century just had radically less at his disposal, and that this feeling of that somehow the tradition had slipped out of the hand of people, and that the people who were kind of in charge of the tradition themselves, they had developed arguments why they actually didn't need the tradition, right? Why you didn't need to know these old texts, and I think that is something that bothers. I mean, like a lot of insiders, a lot of whatever ulama, they had stopped being, or they were socialized into a scholarly world in which that wasn't a problem. And that's basically what I call scholasticism. It's like, oh, you don't need to read a Tabari. We have a Tabari, the important opinions of a Tabari we have in the later tafsir tradition. Why do you want to read this old stuff, right? And there are only few people kind of who are in a sense marginal, or who are, of networks of people who are kind of bothered by this. But the grand majority just, does what you are taught to do, right? In a scholarly tradition, as we do, right? We might still cite Goldziher for historical reasons. We don't cite the generation before Goldziher anymore, right? Why? It's like, oh, it's fallen out of the tradition, right? We don't take this seriously, even though Fleischer might have interesting things to say about things. But so I think that there is something that can be quantified, if one looks at it more in detail. That's what this small kind of exercise that I did with Al-Alusi was trying to do, was trying to hint at.
Thank you. Thank you, Islam. Thank you, Ahmed. I will stop the recording in a moment, and I would very much like to welcome many of you next week when Amr Riyad will be our guest, and he'll take us to the world of interwar Europe, where Salafi and Ahmadi missionaries were creating new networks that are also in some ways related to the kinds of activities we have been talking about so far. So thank you very much.